Imagine you're an unknown engineer in 1941, holding a blueprint everyone calls insane. War is devastating your country, millions are dying, and you have just 90 days to create a weapon that has never existed before. Fail, and your nation falls. Succeed, and you change war forever. This is the true story of how one humble man transformed scrap metal into terror, genius into thunder, and how his impossible creation became the scream of vengeance that made the Nazis tremble. Before we dive into this epic journey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever heard the legendary sound of the Katyusha. Get ready, because what you're about to discover goes far beyond a simple weapon of war. This isn't just the story of a military invention. It's the saga of how humility, creativity under extreme pressure, and the refusal to accept the impossible changed the course of human history. It's about a man who faced ridicule, institutional disbelief, and time itself too. Prove that sometimes the greatest revolutions come from the most unexpected places, from the most unlikely minds. When all the Soviet military experts, veteran engineers, and decorated generals said something couldn't be done, one quiet man, almost invisible in the corridors of power, proved them all wrong. And what he created wasn't just a machine of war, it was a symphony of destruction that would forever change how nations fight. Andrei Kostikov wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to find changing the fate of a world war. Born to a modest family in rural Russia, son of a rural schoolteacher and a seamstress, Kostikov grew up in a world where every resource was precious, every material had to be repurposed, and creativity wasn't luxury. It was survival. While other Soviet engineers came from prestigious military academies in Moscow and Leningrad, flaunting medals and connections to the party elite, Kostikov graduated from a provincial technical school, working during the day in factories to pay for his night classes. His genius didn't come from complex formulas learned in elegant rooms, but from years fixing broken machines with pieces of wire, transforming dead engines into functional tools, seeing possibilities where others saw only junk. In 1938, Kostikov was transferred to an obscure rocket research institute in Moscow, the RNII, not through recognized merit, but because they needed someone to do the work nobody else wanted. Testing failed prototypes, cleaning laboratories after explosions, documenting inglorious experiments. While senior engineers presented grandiose projects to the Kremlin, intercontinental missile designs and revolutionary bombers that never left the drawing board, Kostikov spent nights in freezing warehouses, silently studying the trajectory of primitive rockets, calculating launch angles in oil-stained notebooks, dreaming not of grandeur, but of efficiency, simplicity, something that would actually work when most needed. He had a philosophy his colleagues considered too primitive for a real scientist. A weapon that can't be built quickly is a weapon that can't save lives. A weapon so complex it breaks on the battlefield is as useful as having no weapon at all. And then came June 1941. Operation Barbarossa exploded like a hurricane of steel across Soviet borders. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of panzer tanks and Luftwaffe aircraft, tore through Soviet defenses like paper. Within weeks, entire cities fell. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. The Red Army was being annihilated. Soviet soldiers fought with obsolete rifles, often sharing weapons between 2 or 3 men. Conventional artillery was too heavy to retreat quickly, too slow to reposition, and there was desperate shortage of ammunition. Stalin was in panic. In the secret corridors of the Kremlin, emergency meetings happened every hour. Generals screamed at each other, pointing fingers, blaming previous purges that executed competent officers, blaming lack of preparation, blaming everything except their own failed strategies. It was in this apocalyptic chaos that the desperate order came. We need a new weapon, something mobile, something that can hit the enemy with devastating force and disappear before counterattack. Something we can mass produce with resources we have now, not what we hope to have in 2 years. Bring me solutions in 72 hours, or bring me your resignation letters. The message was clear. Either Soviet engineering produced a miracle, or the Soviet Union would cease to exist. At RNII, senior engineers panicked. They presented elaborate designs requiring rare new metals, new guidance systems that would take months to develop, new factories that would have to be built from scratch. Each proposal was technically impressive, each was completely unfeasible. A veteran chief engineer, decorated hero of the revolution, proposed a radio-guided rocket launch system requiring imported components that simply no longer existed due to wartime blockade. Another suggested adapting naval artillery systems for ground use, a project that would take at least 6 months. Each man defended his idea with passion, with complex calculations, with elegant diagrams. and each idea was absolutely useless for the present moment. Andrei Kostikov remained silent during these initial meetings, sitting in the back of the room, a gray man in a worn suit, taking notes in his weathered notebook. When he finally raised his hand to speak, several engineers rolled their eyes. The institute director, a robust man named Kurchevsky, known for his arrogance and political connections, sighed audibly. Kostikov, we don't have time for your village mechanic ideas. We're discussing cutting-edge science here, not tractor repairs. Nervous laughter echoed through the room. But the political commissar present, following orders to listen to all proposals, nodded for Kostikov to continue. Kostikov stood slowly, carrying not complex diagrams but simple hand-drawn sketches. Comrades, he began in a calm, almost monotone voice, you're all trying to reinvent war. I propose we use what we already have. Trucks. We have thousands of trucks. Rockets. We already have RS-132 rockets that work, used on aircraft. Metal tubes. We have factories full of tubes. My proposal is simple. We weld tubes into racks, mount these racks on the back of ordinary trucks, load the rockets, and fire in volleys. No complexity, no fragile. Electronics. No months of development. We can have a working prototype in 2 weeks. The silence that followed wasn't one of admiration. It was absolute disbelief. Kurchevsky was the first to explode in laughter. Welded tubes? Trucks? You're proposing we turn the Red Army into a scrapyard? This is ridiculous. Unacceptably primitive. The rockets will have no accuracy whatsoever. The structure won't withstand the recoil. The trucks will catch fire. You're wasting our time with amateur fantasies. Other engineers joined the chorus of disdain. This has never worked anywhere in the world. You'll kill our own soldiers with accidental explosions. This is an insult to Soviet engineering. But there was something in Kostikov's gaze that made the political commissar pause. It was the calm of someone who had already calculated every objection, tested every variable in his mind 1,000 times. Let me build a prototype, Kostikov said simply. If it fails, you can transfer me to Siberia. But if it works, give me 90 days and the resources I requested. Nothing more. The debate intensified. Kurchevsky demanded the idea be discarded immediately. Other engineers argued it was too risky, too simplistic, that they would be humiliated before the high command if they presented a peasant weapon. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to suffocate the air. That's when the commissar, a pragmatic man named Vanikov, made a decision that would change everything. Kostikov will have his 15 days for a prototype. If he achieves something that works, we continue. If not, we never hear about it again. Kurchevsky, you'll continue developing your guidance system. We'll have 2 simultaneous paths. It was a political compromise, nothing more. Nobody really believed Kostikov would succeed. The expression on his face was of someone who'd just been sent to the battlefield with a knife against tanks. And so began the impossible journey. Kostikov assembled a small team. 3 young technicians nobody else wanted, a welder with an arm crippled from an industrial accident, and 2 engineering students who hadn't yet graduated. They didn't give him a modern laboratory, but an abandoned industrial warehouse on the outskirts of Moscow with a leaking roof and dirt floor. They didn't give him new materials but access to a military scrap depot, rusted tubes, dented metal sheets, rejected components from other projects. His office was a wooden table propped up on bricks. His computing team was an abacus and his own manual calculations by candlelight when electricity failed. But Kostikov had something no degree could give. A visceral understanding of how simple materials could be manipulated, how forces could be distributed, how true elegance lies in functional simplicity, not impressive complexity. He worked 18 hours a day, sleeping 3 hours on sandbags in the warehouse. His hands became covered in welding burns, his eyes red from exhaustion, his clothes permanently stained with grease and soot. While Kurchevsky presented elegant reports in Kremlin meetings, smiling with his gold teeth, Kostikov was on his knees in the mud, testing inclination angles, calculating weight distribution, discovering that if he reinforced the truck base with X-shaped beams and added improvised shock absorbers made from springs from abandoned train cars, the structure could withstand the recoil. On the 10th day came the first test. Kostikov had mounted 8 tubes on a rudimentary rack on the back of a ZSE-6 truck, a common commercial vehicle. The rockets were RS-132s, originally designed for aircraft but adapted for ground launch. Vanikov arrived at the improvised test field, accompanied by Kurchevsky and several skeptical military officers. Kurchevsky couldn't hide his smile of superiority. "Comrade Commissar, I hope you brought a medic. When this explodes, we'll need one." The officers laughed, some already preparing mental reports about the failure. Kostikov, his face covered in soot, climbed onto the back of the truck and performed final checks personally. His hands trembled, not from fear but from pure exhaustion. He descended, signaled his small team to retreat to a safe distance behind a sandbag barricade, and activated the electrical firing mechanism he had improvised himself. What happened in the next seconds rewrote everyone's expectations. The first rocket fired with a deafening roar, leaving a trail of fire and smoke. Then the second. Then the third. Within 6 seconds, all 8 rockets were launched in sequence, creating a sharp, unmistakable scream that echoed across the test field like the howl of some mythical creature. The impact was devastating. The rockets hit a target area of approximately 100 square meters, completely obliterating the wooden targets that had been positioned. The ground was charred, craters opening where there had been level earth. But most importantly, the truck was still intact. There was no explosion, there was no fire, the structure had held. The silence after the last explosion was absolute. Vanikov stood slack-jawed. The military officers looked like they'd seen a ghost. And Kurchevsky was pale, his expression transformed from ironic superiority to genuine shock. Kostikov walked calmly to the truck, checked the structure with his hands, looked at the tubes still smoking, and then turned to Vanikov. "It works. Now give me the 90 days and the Yassi resources. I can make versions with 16 tubes, maybe 24 or more. We can mass produce using any available truck. Each battalion could have several of these systems. The enemy will never know where the attack came from before we disappear." His voice was steady, without arrogance, just the quiet certainty of someone who had just proved the impossible. But Kurchevsky's humiliation was only beginning. The chief engineer, red with anger, advanced toward Kostikov. "That was luck. Pure luck. Anyone can fire rockets. Where's the precision? Where's the control? This is a carnival toy, not a serious military weapon. You're going to embarrass the Soviet Union with this scrap." He turned to Vanikov, his voice rising an octave. "Comrade Commissar, you can't be seriously considering this. My guidance system offers 10-meter precision. This absurdity barely hits the right side of the battlefield." Kostikov remained calm, but something changed in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was deep disappointment. "Comrade Kurchevsky, with all respect, soldiers are dying now. Not in 6 months when your miraculous guidance system is ready. Now. The Wehrmacht is 300 kilometers from Moscow. They won't wait for your 10-meter precision. This weapon can be built in weeks, not years. It can be operated by soldiers with minimal training, not specialized technicians. It can be repaired in the field with basic tools. And yes, it doesn't have surgical precision, but it has something far more valuable. Devastating volume of fire that terrorizes the enemy, destroys morale, and can be delivered repeatedly without exposing our soldiers." The tension between the two men was palpable. It represented something larger than conflicting personalities. It was the Soviet old guard, obsessed with technological prestige and impressive appearances, versus a new generation that understood war wasn't won on paper, but in mud, in blood, with tools that actually existed. Vanikov felt this division deeply. He himself had grown up in a working-class family, understood the difference between elegant theory and brutal reality. "Kurchevsky," Vanikov said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "continue your work. Your system may be valuable in the future, but Kostikov will receive resources for immediate development. 90 days. Full Stavka approval. This is non-negotiable." The decision was made, but the war between these two visions of engineering, between institutional arrogance and innovative humility, was only beginning. The next 90 days were hell of relentless work. Kostikov was transferred to better but still modest facilities. He received an expanded team, but many were factory workers without formal training in rocket engineering. He received materials, but never enough, always having to improvise, always having to adapt. And throughout this entire period, Kurchevsky and his allies in Soviet bureaucracy did everything in their power to sabotage, delay, discredit the project. Critical reports were sent to Stavka weekly, questioning safety, viability, costs, the sanity of investing in peasant technology. But Kostikov had something his detractors couldn't combat: results. Every week a new improved prototype was tested, first with 16 tubes, then 24, then 36. The structure was refined, the reload system simplified, the rockets optimized for maximum range. And then came the accidental discovery that would transform the Katyusha into legend. During a test, a rocket was fired with a slightly misaligned stabilizer. Instead of flying straight, it created a sharp whistle, a scream that pierced eardrums. Kostikov, instead of discarding this as failure, saw potential. The psychological effect, he murmured, taking notes frantically. Terror is as powerful a weapon as the explosion. He deliberately incorporated this defect into the final design. Each rocket now produced that unmistakable scream during flight, a sound that German soldiers would later describe as Hell's Howl, or the Siren of Death. It wasn't just a weapon that destroyed bodies, it was a weapon that destroyed minds, that made experienced men panic and flee before impact even occurred. Stalin, upon hearing about this, was fascinated. Fear is half the battle, he said. Make them hear death coming. On day 75, with 15 days remaining in the deadline, came the crisis. The main factory supplying launch tubes suffered a German bombing. Half the production was destroyed. The timeline was collapsing. Kurchevsky practically danced with joy upon hearing the news, immediately sending a memorandum to Stavka. The Kostikov project has failed to meet production deadlines. I respectfully suggest reallocation of resources to more reliable systems. It seemed like the end of the line. Kostikov didn't sleep for 3 days. He personally visited every scrap depot in Moscow, every munitions factory, every rail facility. And he found a solution that would never have occurred to elite engineers. Industrial drainage pipes. Pipes used in water and sewage systems, made of reinforced steel, abundant, ignored by everyone because they weren't appropriate military materials. With small modifications, they worked perfectly. The problem was solved in 48 hours. Production continued without significant pause. Finally came day 90, June 21st, 1941, exactly 3 months after the project began. A complete demonstration was scheduled for the Soviet High Command, including direct representatives of Stalin. It would be the final judgment. Kurchevsky prepared his own parallel presentation, a guided artillery system he had hastily accelerated, confident it would outperform Kostikov's circus trick. The test field was packed. Generals, political commissars, engineers from across the country, even carefully selected war correspondents. Kurchevsky's system was presented first. It was visually impressive. Polished cannons, control panels with precise dials, a team of 12 uniformed operators demonstrating impeccable coordination. He fired 3 guided projectiles that hit targets with admirable precision. The crowd applauded politely. Kurchevsky took a theatrical bow, casting a triumphant look at Kostikov. Gentlemen, this is Soviet engineering at its finest. Precision, control, dignity. Then it was Kostikov's turn. His team brought 3 ordinary ZIS-6 trucks, seemingly nothing special, each carrying a rack of tubes on the back. There was no polish, no ceremony, no impressive uniforms. Just ordinary men in dirty work overalls, positioning the vehicles quickly. Murmurs of disappointment ran through the crowd. It looked disappointing, primitive. Exactly what critics had predicted. Kostikov made no speech, no elaborate presentation. He simply nodded, and the first truck fired its complete volley of 16 rockets in less than 10 seconds. The scream was deafening. The impact, devastating. Before anyone could fully process what they'd just witnessed, the second truck fired, then the third. In less than a minute, 48 rockets had been launched, covering an area equivalent to 3 football fields in consecutive explosions. The ground shook. Ears rang, smoke covered the horizon, and then, while everyone was still stunned, the 3 trucks started their engines and departed quickly, disappearing in different directions through pre-planned routes. Complete attack, complete withdrawal, in less than 3 minutes from start to finish. The silence that followed was deafening in a different way. Nobody applauded because nobody could process what they'd just witnessed. It was war in a form they'd never imagined. General Zhukov, who would later command some of the most decisive Soviet victories, was present. He was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. How many of these can we produce per month? Kostikov, his face covered in soot and sweat, responded simply, with adequate resources, 500 complete systems by year's end. Maybe more. Zhukov turned to Vanikov. Make it happen. I don't care what's necessary. Kurchevsky was destroyed. His precise, elegant system, technically superior in every aspect of traditional engineering, had been completely overshadowed by tubes welded on trucks. He tried to protest, pointing out that his system had better hit rate, lower cost per projectile, more technological prestige. But Vanikov cut him off brutally. Comrade Kurchevsky, your weapon can kill 10 Germans with precision. Kostikov's weapon can kill 100 Germans with terror. And it can do that 10 times while yours is being reloaded. War isn't an elegance competition. It's survival. What happened after that moment would reveal even more about Kostikov's character and the true nature of greatness under pressure. While Khrushchevsky was being publicly demoted, his team dismantled, his resources reallocated, he remained in the field, visibly shattered, humiliated before his peers. Kostikov could have simply left in triumph. But he didn't. Kostikov walked over to Khrushchevsky, who was sitting on a wooden bench with his head in his hands, and sat beside him. "Your guidance system," Kostikov said quietly, "is brilliant engineering. It may not serve for now, but when this war is finished, when we have time to refine, to properly train operators, it will have its place. I would like you to join my team as senior consultant to improve Katyusha precision in future iterations. Your knowledge shouldn't be wasted over pride." Khrushchevsky raised his head, tears of humiliation in his eyes. "Why would you do this? I tried to destroy you. I sabotaged your material requests. I spread rumors that you were incompetent. Why offer me anything but revenge?" His voice was broken. All arrogance evaporated, replaced by genuine shame. Kostikov smiled sadly. "Because this war is bigger than our egos. Because you have real talent that can save Soviet lives if properly directed. And because I know what it's like to be looked down upon, to be called incompetent by people who never got their hands dirty. I won't perpetuate that cycle. I'll break it." He extended his hand. "So, comrade engineer, will you help me improve what we've built?" That gesture, witnessed by several officers present, became legendary in Soviet military circles. Khrushchevsky, hands trembling, shook Kostikov's hand. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "But I'll spend the rest of my career proving I can live up to this gesture." And he did. Khrushchevsky became one of the most dedicated members of Kostikov's team, contributing significantly to later improvements of the Katyusha system. Production of the BM-13 Katyusha exploded. Factories in Moscow, Stalingrad, even evacuated facilities in the Urals, all converted production lines to create the systems. Ordinary trucks were transformed into rocket launchers in a matter of days. Operators were trained in weeks, not months. And crucially, the system was so simple it could be maintained and repaired by ordinary mechanics with basic tools, not requiring rare specialists. The first combat use came in July 1941 near Orsha. An experimental battery of 7 Katyusha launchers, commanded by Captain Ivan Flerov, ambushed a German concentration of troops and vehicles at a rail station. The attack lasted less than 20 seconds. More than 200 rockets covered the area. When the smoke cleared, the station was in ruins, dozens of German vehicles burning, hundreds of soldiers dead or wounded. But the psychological impact was even greater. Surviving German soldiers, hardened veterans who had fought through Poland and France without flinching, were found in shock, some crying, others catatonic, all repeating the same thing. "Stalin orgel! Stalin orgel! Stalin's organ." The nickname stuck. The Germans called it Stalin orgel because of the sound of multiple tubes firing, resembling the pipes of a church organ playing the music of death. The Soviets preferred a more affectionate name. Katyusha, a famous folk song about a woman waiting for her beloved to return from war. The name humanized the weapon, transformed it from instrument of terror into symbol of hope, of resistance, that the Soviet Union could and would strike back. But keeping the Katyusha secret became Stalin's obsession. Katyusha units were guarded by the NKVD, the secret police. Operators swore under penalty of death never to be captured alive. If a launcher was at risk of capture, it was destroyed by its own crew. The Germans desperately tried to capture an intact system for replication, but for months they failed, further increasing the weapon's mythical terror. The Katyusha was used in all subsequent decisive battles. The defense of Moscow in winter 1941, where Katyusha batteries positioned on rooftops and parks repelled German advances. The bloody defense of Stalingrad, where the Katyusha's scream echoed constantly among the ruins, a constant reminder that defenders still fought. The Battle of Kursk, where massive concentrations of Katyusha launchers helped destroy the largest German tank offensive of the war. And Andrei Kostikov. He never sought personal glory. He refused medals multiple times, insisting credit belonged to factory teams, to soldiers who operated the systems, to engineers like Khrushchevsky who helped refine them. When finally forced to accept the title of Hero of the Soviet Union in 1942, his ceremony was brief and understated at his request. In his speech he said, I didn't invent anything miraculous, I just listened to what the war was screaming, that sometimes the simplest answer is the most powerful, that genius doesn't need complexity, and that humility in accepting limitations can be more creative than arrogance in denying them. But the Katyusha story doesn't end with military success. It revealed profound truths about innovation, leadership, and human nature that transcend war. After the war, when Western engineers studied captured Katyusha systems, they were simultaneously impressed and baffled. How had something so primitive been so effective? The answer troubled many. Because complexity often masks inadequacy. Because technical elegance doesn't guarantee practical relevance. Because institutions tend to reward appearance of sophistication over genuine functionality. The contrast between Kostikov and Korchevsky became a case study in military academies worldwide. Korchevsky represented the danger of ego disconnected from operational reality. Brilliant in theory, useless in urgent practice. Kostikov represented the virtue of humility combined with practical mastery, willing to appear simple if it meant saving lives. Korchevsky's transformation from arrogant antagonist to dedicated collaborator illustrated another truth: that redemption is possible when pride gives way to greater purpose. Decades after the war, in 1974, a young Soviet reporter interviewed Kostikov, then an elderly retired man, in a modest Moscow apartment. The reporter asked, "Comrade hero, what would you say is the most important lesson from the Katyusha?" Kostikov, eyes still bright with intelligence despite his age, replied, "That true strength doesn't come from impressing others, but from serving a purpose greater than yourself. That real innovation often looks humble because it's focused on working, not on looking impressive. That the greatest barriers to problem solving aren't technical. They're egos that refuse to accept that unconventional methods can be superior. And perhaps most importantly, that the only adequate response to success is grace, not arrogance, because tomorrow you might be the one needing a second chance." The Katyusha was produced in more than 10,000 units during the war. It was copied or inspired similar systems in dozens of countries. American multiple rocket launchers, German Nebelwerfers developed in desperate response to the Katyusha, British versions, Chinese, and eventually modern systems, like the American M2C70 MLRS and Russian BM-30 Smerch. Each of these systems, some costing millions of dollars in cutting-edge technology, owes its conceptual existence to that prototype of welded tubes on a truck built in a warehouse with a leaking roof by an engineer everyone looked down upon. Today, if you visit the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow, there's a room dedicated to the Katyusha. In the center stands one of the original 1941 launchers, preserved exactly as it was. Rusted tubes, peeling paint, visible and irregular welds mounted on a worn civilian truck. It doesn't look impressive. It looks exactly like what it is: scrap transformed into salvation through necessity and genius. On the wall beside it, there's a photo of Andrei Kostikov, not in elaborate uniform, but in his grease-stained work overalls, smiling modestly at the camera, his hands still holding tools. The inscription on the plaque sums it all up. Sometimes changing the world doesn't require reinventing it. It requires having the courage to use what we have in ways nobody had the humility to imagine. If this story impacted you, if it made you think about how humility, creativity under pressure, and refusal to accept the status quo can literally change the course of history, leave your like. Share this with someone who needs to hear that great solutions don't always come from expected places, that being underestimated can be your greatest advantage, and that true leadership means elevating others, even those who tried to bring you down. Write in the comments which part of Kostikov's journey inspired you most, and subscribe to the channel because history is full of unlikely heroes whose lessons can transform how you face your own impossible challenges. The Katyusha wasn't just a weapon. It was a declaration that when humanity is challenged to the extreme, when all conventional options fail, it's the combination of humility, desperate creativity, and refusal to accept defeat that forges miracles. And that lesson, my friend, is as relevant today as it was in that freezing warehouse in 1941 when an ordinary man decided to prove that the impossible was just what nobody had enough courage to attempt.